Dear participants, dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you for joining us again today. I would like also to welcome newcomers. My name is Svetlana Platon. I'm Senior Financial Management Specialist at the World Bank Center for Financial and Sustainability Reporting Reform. Before we start, we need to follow the protocol again and announce the housekeeping arrangements. Simultaneous interpretation is available today in Russian, Albanian, and Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. To hear the interpretation, you need to select your preferred language. Please press the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom meeting window. If you cannot see the globe icon, please press the three dots icon and you will be able to select your preferred language. To hear your language only and more clearly, please click mute original audio. Katerina, please move to next slide. Your microphone and camera are automatically muted and turned off during the entire event. For questions, please use Q&A box instead of the chat. Only most relevant questions will and that haven't already been covered during the presentation will be selected and answered live during the Q&A session at the end of our presentation. The event is being recorded and the recording in all languages for all 4 webinars will be available on CFRR webpage in September, and we will share the link with all registered participants. Webinars are organized by the WorldBank Center for Financial and Sustainability Reporting Reform under our regional program Enhancing Accounting, Auditing and Sustainability Reporting. The program is co-funded by the Federal Ministry of Finance of Austria, the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, and the Austrian Development Agency. We are very thankful to our donors for supporting this important reform agenda. Let me briefly recap what we covered so far in the first 2 webinars. In session 1, we discussed IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, objective, scope, and how global standards align with European requirements. Just to remind you that additional guidance and educational materials are available on IFRS Foundation website. The second session focused on industry-specific disclosures based on standards issued by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. We look at practical examples and case studies to better understand how these standards apply across sectors. Since SASB standards can be applied regardless of the mandatory sustainability reporting framework, which could be based on financial materiality like global standards or on impact materiality like European sustainability reporting standards. So we kindly encourage you to consider how to best utilize the available guidance. Today, we'll discuss about regulatory adoption, and our distinguished speakers will guide us over tools and resources that support regulators in designing roadmaps and policies for adopting ISSB standards. This webinar will be moderated by my colleague Arun Manuja, Senior Financial Management Specialist. Arun is a financial management specialist coordinator for Europe and Central Asia West, working on various fiduciary and public financial management matters in the region. As part of YASHUR regional program, Arun is leading the component on monitoring and enforcement and co-leading the component on sustainability reporting. Over to you, Arun.
Thank you, Svetlana. So, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. And on behalf of the Europe and Central Asia Financial Management Team and Fabian Cederer, who is my manager, I would like to welcome all of you. And it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Brevo and Evie Robertson. So, Jonathan Brevo is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at IFRS Foundation, where he leads the IFRS Foundation's engagement with regulators and policymakers at a global level. He has extensive experience in public policy and capital market regulations, and he has been focusing a lot on sustainability reporting since it has been in the news. Jonathan also served as the first finance controller of Public Interest Oversight Board and worked for several years in PricewaterhouseCoopers in Spain. Now, coming to Evie Robertson. Evie is a regulatory affairs manager and at IFRS Foundation. She's leading the work with implementation partners to support adoption of ISSB standards. And keep in mind that she was part of the team that facilitated the creation of International Sustainability Standard Board at COP26 on behalf of IFRS Foundation. And also know that she's very critical for us and why we collaborate with her, because prior to joining all these organizations that we talked about, she was working as a political and economic advisor to the former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown and has extensive experience in strategy consulting. So with this, welcome again, Evie and Jonathan, and I hand over the floor to you both, as I understand one of you will be presenting the slides and one of you will start speaking. Over to you, friends.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thank you as well, I think, to Svetlana. Again, we are really pleased to be able to address today the distinguished audience, and I would like to commend, I think, the WorldBank and the Center for Financial and Sustainability Reporting Reform for organizing these sessions. I think these sessions are really timely, and the purpose of them is really to try to navigate some of the developments in the sustainability reporting space and try to ensure you have a good understanding and can become familiar with some of the tools, the guidance, the materials that we're developing to support jurisdictions, but as well to support stakeholders, I think, in your respective markets. So with that, we have put together, I think, a few slides, and I will ask my colleague, Evie, I'm delighted to be joined today by Evie, to place them, I think, on screen. Thank you very much, Evie, and Arun, thank you very much, I think, for your kind words, I think, on introducing ourselves. So if we can move, perhaps, Evie, to the next slide, just providing a bit of an overview of what we're covering today. And our intent is to try to provide some information that's going to be useful for you and allow, of course, time for you to raise questions and address any points you think that we should cover as well. So we intend to perhaps provide an update on what we're seeing in the jurisdictional space, jurisdictions coming on board, adopting ISSB standards, a bit of the program that we've been working on in order to support, particularly jurisdictional authorities, regulators, policymakers, enhance, I think, their understanding and their considerations with respect to the adoption of our standards. Try to connect with some of the foundational documents that we have issued, the jurisdictional guide, that's very much, I think, one of the foundational documents to support regulators. Try to advance some of the work that we will be progressing in the course of the summer that may support some of the key decisions that you will confront in your jurisdictions. And again, very specifically, the purpose of this session is to drill down into the roadmap development tool, which intends to unpack some of the high-level considerations for you to try to identify what's a suitable action plan roadmap for your jurisdiction to pursue. So with that, Evie, let's perhaps move into the next slide. And I know that some of you have been participating in the previous sessions, and I wanted to bring together how the work we are conducting with regulators, with jurisdictions, with the official sector at the IFRS Foundation intertwines with some of the previous sessions and some of the work that you have seen we are progressing from a technical point of view, as well as some of our future agenda. So we do have three key priorities, I think, for this year, for next year, and some of them will remain as part of our core objectives going forward. One is, of course, to support implementation. This is why we're putting together some materials. We're running some capacity building. We are setting, I think, a forum for stakeholders of any kind to put out questions that they come up as they confront the implementation of S1 and S2. You will have seen that we recently launched an exposure draft on enhancing SASB standards, and that consultation is running for 150 days, and we would invite you very much to look into the consultation piece and, of course, provide input. I think it's important that the global baseline, global standards do benefit, I think, from the voice and input from different regions, from different stakeholders. And as well, we're working on our future plan, work on nature, biodiversity, human capital. We've conducted already a first phase in research there. But of course, our standards are useful, but they need to be put in practice. And I think will not come as a surprise to many of you that the establishment of the ISSB supports, on the one hand, trying to rationalize what we've called the alphabet soup of different requirements, try to address the fragmentation in the space, but of course, try to support that move from voluntary reporting to mandatory reporting. And again, working, I think, with jurisdictions, supporting regulatory adoption is key, and this is what we will be covering in the session today. So if we can move to the next slide, I would like to perhaps provide a bit of an update of how other jurisdictions are considering the adoption of ISSB standards, which ones are perhaps moving ahead adopting the standards. And I think it's relevant to note that as of today, 36 jurisdictions have either taken decided steps, have introduced our regulations, or have already articulated a roadmap, setting their direction of travel, presenting some milestones for their market participants. And I think it's relevant. I will be noting before the jurisdictions that are already on the journey, but they represent over 60% of the global GDP, over 40% of global market cap, and around 60% of GHG emissions. So the jurisdictions already on the journey, they do have a significant gravitational effect that will impact other jurisdictions because of the trade considerations and the way they can set requirements that can impact cross-border considerations. So we can move to the next slide, just very quickly covering which are the ones on the journey. And again, we see developments almost on a weekly basis. So it's very likely that this table will be outdated in a month's time. So stay tuned. We're trying to provide visibility, I think, to the marketplace. So you'll see that there is significant developments around the world, all regions, jurisdictions with different type of economic settings, different depths and breadth of markets, ranging from the very developed, sophisticated markets, the international financial hubs, as well as emerging markets and developing economies that they see the value of adopting ISSB standards in order to ensure that they can strengthen transparency and enhance capital markets efficiency. So a number of developments as well in the EMEA region. Of course, you're familiar with the developments, I think, in the EU, but I think the UK very recently also put out a consultation, developments in Switzerland, and a lot of developments as well in Africa. So this is, again, it's a journey where emerging markets actually are almost front-running developments. They've really embraced the idea of ISSB standards as an enabler to strengthen their capital markets. And Evie will be covering that as part of the policy rationale. So if we can move on, Evie, to the next slide. Again, just wanted to share with you one of the recent developments. And I think by mid-June, we published the first set of jurisdictional profiles and snapshots, which are intended to provide transparency on global progress towards the adoption of ISSB standards. And this was really intentional since we set the standards back in June 23. We realized, I think, very quickly that investors, preparers, as well as regulators and policymakers, they wanted granular, detailed information as to how other jurisdictions were progressing with their adoption. So it is relevant for investors because they are the beneficiaries of the disclosures being provided, and they need to understand really the degree of alignment of the jurisdictional frameworks that are being lined up in different countries with respect to ISSB standards. It's also relevant for preparers because many companies do have cross-border operations and transactions, and they're likely to be captured by more than one jurisdictional framework. You can imagine the large corporations that do have branches and subsidiaries around the world, they're likely to be captured by regulations around the world. So they have an increasing interest in being familiar with how the ISSB standards are being adopted. And of course, importantly, for regulators, jurisdictions, policymakers, that they will be checking, they will have in their radar screen how the neighboring jurisdictions, those countries for which they do have trade, where they have significant economic transactions, because it's very likely that those requirements may also impact the way in which they set regulations for their regulated entities. So we've set up those initial profiles and snapshots. We've covered in the first batch 17 profiles, 16 snapshots, and all of this information, I'll cover it later on. It's based on that foundational document that I mentioned before, the jurisdictional guide. So if we can move, Evie, to the next slide. Just let me provide a bit of an overview. What's the difference between a profile and a snapshot? And again, you can probably, you're aware that many jurisdictions are actually phasing in requirements in order to tune those requirements to the state of readiness and preparedness in their markets. So we have set up jurisdictional profiles for those jurisdictions that have finalized their approach. This means that they may have even issued standards, and regulators have passed legislation or regulation to prescribe on a mandatory basis the application of those standards, or in some cases, it's just been listing rules subjecting listed entities to the requirements, but their approach is settled and finalized. In other circumstances, some jurisdictions have made significant progress. They may have finalized standards, and they still need to make a decision with respect to which are the entities, which are the effective dates that for those standards, I think, to be applied. But again, we wanted to provide that information that's meaningful so that the markets, different stakeholders, different jurisdictions, yourselves, do know how ISSB standards are being adopted at a global level. If we can move to the next slide, just giving you a bit of a teaser of what type of information you can find in the profiles. So again, I'll be covering that later on, but this is very much based on the features that we outlined in the jurisdictional guide. Those jurisdictional approaches, we're covering that at length today in the session, because these are key foundational pillars of the roadmap development tool. We can move to the next one. EB, one piece of information that I find particularly relevant is that in addition of providing information on the type of entities that are subject to the requirements, the effective dates, whether any transition reliefs have been incorporated into the regulatory framework, we are including as well information about what we have described as jurisdictional approaches. And I'll be touching on that later on, but the relevance of that is that it allows to almost compare approaches against each other. And, it is relevant, I think, for different stakeholders to understand what are the requirements in the jurisdiction as of today, as of July 25, but what will be the regulatory framework once the roadmap milestones have been completed, the roadmap has been fully executed. So what's the resulting regulatory framework, what we've called the target? Where does the jurisdiction want to land once they have navigated through perhaps some of the market readiness issues that suggest that they should be incorporating the standards at a different pace for different entities? So this is relevant information that I think many stakeholders have come back to us saying that that is relevant. So we can move to the next slide. In terms of the profiles, I think it's relevant to note that 14 of the 17 profiles, 14 of those jurisdictions have targeted full adoption of ISSB standards. That means that once they have completed their roadmaps, their standards will either be IFRS 1 and IFRS 2, or will be local standards that have been designed to deliver functionally aligned outcomes. This is in those 14 jurisdictions. Investors reading a report from each of those jurisdictions, they will have comparable information, which is one of the core objectives we're trying to address at the ISSB. 2 of those jurisdictions are targeting adopting the climate requirements in ISSB standards, which means that they haven't yet made a decision to extend the scope of topics beyond climate. But with respect to climate, the requirements are aligned with the climate requirements in ISSB standards. So basically, IFRS is 2 and the relevant portions of IFRS is 1. And one jurisdiction is partially incorporating ISSB standards. And the reason for that, it's not that they have different requirements, that they have introduced modifications. It's only because at this stage, they are only onboarding certain entities that have public accountability, and it is not a comprehensive set of regulated entities. We'll touch into that when we look into which are the entities that should be subject to regulation. But I think it's pretty compelling. Out of the 17 jurisdictions that have already finalized their approach, all of them will be significantly aligning with ISSB standards. I think this is good news for global markets because investors, preparers will have a set of standards that they can use, both for assessing and pricing sustainability risks and opportunities, but also for streamlining reporting, avoiding duplicating efforts in terms of producing report and concentrating strategically on what is really core for the company, which is managing, strategizing about what are risks and opportunities. If we can move to the next one, 16 snapshots. These jurisdictions are well advanced in their journey, but they haven't fully finalized. And again, this is a moving target. When we prepared this slide, Rwanda, for instance, had not finalized their approach, but they now have finalized. So we will be profiling Rwanda, I think, very soon. And we're very likely to see developments, I think, in Indonesia and other parts of the world very soon. So some of these jurisdictions will be very soon completing their roadmap. And again, just wanted to signal here the really high degree of alignment of those proposals. What is the reason why I'm bringing this to your attention? I think it's relevant to note because some of these markets are significantly large. And I'm sure that many of the companies in your jurisdictions will somehow be impacted by requirements stemming from these jurisdictions. Just to give you an example, one of your companies that may do business or have operations, for instance, with Japan or Australia, they will be likely having to provide some sort of reporting. So having a proper understanding of ISSB standards is going to enable your market participants to be ready to fulfill those obligations. And certainly for many of you that will somehow be also in progressing with CSRD, IFRS's considerations, ISSB standards are also a key enabler to allow providing disclosures that will eventually be in compliance with IFRS. So we believe that ISSB standards are a good starting point to meet CSRD-related requirements. And we'll be touching later on as to the work that we've been conducting with our European counterparts, the European Commission, IFRAC, in order to ensure there is interoperability. And I will reflect on the interoperability guide as an enabler to allow meeting the requirements and complying with the requirements in both set of standards. We can move to the final slide in this section, EB. Again, we'll be covering later on how this supports some of the work that we've been conducting to provide tools and resources to jurisdictions. But we think that as part of our core materials, we've mentioned the guide. We'll be talking about the policy rationale. We'll be talking about the roadmap development tool, some of the educational materials that are down in the pipeline that we hope we will be addressing probably in the earlier part of 26. But again, we think this is a core capacity building element. Having reference points, you being able to look and compare about the features, the detailed features of other jurisdictions can be instrumental in inspiring what may be a suitable journey for your jurisdiction, what may be a suitable approach that you may want to address with your respective policymakers and regulators. So we think this on itself, that information sharing experience is incredibly valuable to set the tone as well for different regulators and have reference points. The fact that some of you may be aware that Malaysia has come together with a framework may help if you have a market that resembles that, to put that as a benchmark to inspire your approach. So with that, I'll probably hand over to Evie to cover, I think, some of the resources that we're lining up.
Jonathan, before you hand over to Evie, can I ask you something just to warm up the participants?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks. So, Jonathan, you covered very well on the jurisdictional steps, but and we all know that it can be a little bit political in all countries. So,
Yep.
so if the participants who are attending this training, if they want to advocate to their countries for taking jurisdictional steps towards ISSB, what do you think? How can they do that?
Thank you very much, Arun, for the question. I think it is an excellent question, and I think we will be touching later on the policy rationale for the adoption of our standards. So I think that is actually illustrating what are the benefits that many jurisdictions have signaled that ISSB standards can bring to their respective markets. I think a key element here is that in order to strengthen capital markets, investor needs decision useful information. And they will continue to claim this information, whether a jurisdiction has perhaps a political stance of not progressing that much on ESG, or whether they're really embracing sustainable finance. Investors need decision useful information in order to be able to assess what are the risks, what are the potential prospects of a company, and decide whether to provide or perhaps take away resources from an entity. The fact that other jurisdictions have already set the tone, it's very likely that either through value chain, either through requirements that may have a bearing on subsidiaries and branches, many of the entities that are regulated in different jurisdictions, including in those countries that are represented in the call today, they will need to do some sort of reporting that's aligned with ISSB standards. And again, one of the key benefits of trying to align with the global baseline is that rather than having a multiple range of reporting frameworks, efforts can be done on concentrating on what has been determined to be useful. This is very much the line that we followed 25 years ago when many jurisdictions embraced IFRS accounting standards as the global language for financial reporting. That was instrumental in ensuring that investors, that preparers had a streamlined reporting platform. And we shouldn't lose sight that having, concentrating efforts, being cost effective, enhances the level of competitiveness of companies, being able to devote resources where it matters, not to reporting, not just as a mere compliance exercise for the sake of reporting to meet the needs of regulators. That is, I think, a smart approach, but Evie will be covering that later on the policy rationale.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's excellent guidance. So Evie, over to you. And participants, we would encourage you to ask questions if you have any. So just put them in the webinar chat and we would be happy to take them and ask Jonathan and Evie to respond to them. Thank you. Evie, over to you.
Definitely. Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to cover a little bit now on what resources we're providing at the IFRS Foundation to be able to support jurisdictions in advancing their adoption journeys. So specifically, I'm going to cover something that we have in our regulatory affairs team that we've created that's called the Regulatory Implementation Program. So it's something we've launched this year to be able to support jurisdictions as they take part on their adoption journey and consider the adoption or other use of the ISSB standards. And we're thinking about this in a sort of three-tiered approach. So both the development of resources, how we can enable partners in the wider ecosystem to support and advance the adoption of the standards. And then delivery. So how can we, with programs like the one today, how can we be able to support jurisdictions both directly and through implementation partners? So we are producing a series of regulatory related content and tools to be able to support regulators in their adoption journeys that take you through those considerations, those decision points, and the different approaches that we're about to outline in the rest of the session as to how the adoption works. And that is stored within the jurisdictional guide. We then have something called the adoption toolkit, which these are resources that take you through the stages towards adoption. So everything from becoming familiar to determining your own policy rationale to considering how you create a roadmap and a plan and involve all the relevant stakeholders towards adoption. And so they are the policy rationale materials that I will cover shortly, and then the roadmap tool, which is the main bulk of our session today. And there are some templates there that give you outline the different approaches in line with our guide. And then finally, regulatory educational content and e-learning, including an FSA module. This is something that's under development at the moment, but really is focused on other considerations within the ecosystem. So for instance, supervisory and assurance considerations that are going to be required. Similar how building understanding of those regulatory considerations, also in line with some of the other modules within the FSA credential that focus on understanding the standards and how we can implement them effectively. Now, these materials we are using to enable and to equip partners and advisors. So the first is through a partner program that we launched earlier in the year. It's called the Implementation Partner Program, and the idea is to provide upskilling of implementation partners on the standards, who will then lead bilateral technical assistance and multi-jurisdictional capacity building efforts like today. And then separately, an implementation advisor program that is under development that will use content such as what I've mentioned earlier to be able to support advisors and independent consultants who work with third-party jurisdictions in their adoption. So the ones that are essentially hired through technical assistance programs to be able to work with different stakeholders within that jurisdiction to assess what's the best path forward. And then we deliver this both bilaterally and through those implementation partners. So we have very strong relationships with regulators, and we directly engage with them. We have our own jurisdictional working group, and we use these resources to be able to support them in their considerations of adoption and other use. So similar, for instance, Jonathan mentions the jurisdictional profiles. We've had very strong engagement there to be able to form those profiles and ensure that they are represented in a manner that is satisfactory, both and true to their plans that the regulators have, but also in line with how the IFRS Foundation outlines the different approaches towards adoption. We also launched in December last year something called the IOSCO GEMC network that has over 30 regulators committed to advancing the adoption or other use of the standards. They're drawn from, so the GEMC network's the Growth and Emerging Markets Committee. And they receive specific enhanced training, technical assistance, capacity building programs. We'd encourage you to join. And then finally, through programs like this with the MDBs, capacity building programs, technical assistance, to be able to walk you through some of the resources that we're developing, walk you through some of those considerations and those adoption journeys that you're on. So I will hand back over to Jonathan, or I'll pause for a second. Has anybody got any questions there on this program? Don't say anything. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Evie. And covering some of the documents that I think we had noted before, I think were foundational. We can move to the next slide. We can probably skip this one. And again, I was talking before, the jurisdictional guidance and foundation document. And again, the objective, and I think Arun was asking, what is really the rationale for adopting ISSB standards? And again, very much our objective has been to promote that global level of consistency and comparability for the benefit, I think, of capital markets. We'll talk later on as to how ISSB standards can also enable other key policy objectives. And I think this will be important as many jurisdictions will want to pursue specific jurisdictional goals, and enhanced, more transparent, more reliable, assurable information can be really foundational and can be the grounding for the development of a further architecture and the sustainable finance markets. But again, the goal of the guide was very much to support jurisdictions in the design of their roadmaps. And again, it was to set the foundations for that degree of transparency that I've been covering before through the jurisdictional profiles. So we can move to the next slide. You heard me talk before about the features of jurisdictional approaches. So what is this that Jonathan is talking about the features? So these were, I think, 11 elements that we thought were relevant for jurisdictions to consider in order to and to be addressed as part of their jurisdictional roadmaps. Again, what is really the regulatory, the legal process that needs to be followed and implemented in the jurisdiction? Which are the entities that should actually be brought on board? How can a jurisdiction navigate through the challenges of perhaps facing entities of different degrees of maturity, readiness, capacity, proficiency in sustainability, reporting, how jurisdictions should be addressing potential adaptations or modifications, how this can be detrimental to that initial goal of achieving that degree of consistency and comparability that we're looking for. Or how can jurisdictions enable a building blocks approach that again provides information that's decision useful to investors in a way that it is not obscured? So how can we enable ISSB standards to construct that broader policy ecosystem? So these are the 11 features that we're covering in the roadmap development tool in a bit more detail. That was already outlined in the jurisdictional guide. If we can move to the next slide, because we'll be touching on this throughout the rest of the presentation. And I mentioned before those description of jurisdictional approaches. So we wanted to be able to put together these descriptions in a way that they were useful for regulators that may want to compare themselves with other jurisdictions, for preparers, as well as for investors. So they range from those jurisdictions that are committing to the adoption. They've publicly signaled their intention to adopt, but the adoption will not happen until a future moment in time. It will also be a nice, I think, characterization of those jurisdictions that will be permitting the use of ISSB standards expressly through regulation and encouraging that use as a way perhaps to build some market readiness before standards become mandatory. Some will do this as a transitional element. Some may have a jurisdictional framework, but may still permit the use of ISSB standards for a certain type of entities because they may be operating perhaps more globally, and it's important for them to be able to leverage on the value of the global baseline. There are others that will be partially incorporating ISSB standards, and I mentioned this already. It is either because the set of entities that they are onboarding may not be sufficiently comprehensive at this stage, or because they're not adopting the full set of requirements in ISSB standards. In some instances, this again may only be a transitional description because this is maybe representing where they are as of 2025, but they have set a goal to be more comprehensive in the future. We also thought it was relevant, I think, for the markets to understand how jurisdictions are leveraging transition reliefs that are already embedded in S1 and S2. And you could probably see this earlier in the SEP and the webinars that we've run, I think, with you. So again, some jurisdictions will be extending reliefs for a shorter period of time. So we're describing them as adopting ISSB standards with limited transitions. Others will be perhaps needing a bit more time in order to get there, which again, very similar description. The only difference is that they have an extended transition period. And as I mentioned before, what we think are really probably the North Star, which is really fully adopting ISSB standards. We think that's the strategy that's most likely to deliver the degree of comparability and consistency that markets have been requiring, which was also one of the reasons why the ISSB was established back at COP26. I think, Arun, you were referring to that, I think, and to role we played there. But again, some jurisdictions may only be focusing on climate yet. Some regulators, policymakers may still not have the legal instruments to proceed beyond climate. And again, we were also wanting to signal those jurisdictions that are adopting the climate standards, maybe as a transitional point before they can expand the scope. So all of this will very much ground the way in which the roadmap development tool helps you assess those features, answer questions that address those features, and what will be the resulting description so that you can actually contrast against how the IFRS Foundation will be describing, I think, the jurisdictional approach. So I think probably relevant that we touch on the policy. Yeah, I think Arun may have some questions there.
So, Jonathan, we have two excellent questions from our colleagues in Central Bank of Armenia.
Right.
So one is, if a regulator has not adopted the Pillar 3 framework, can you still mandate IFRS 1 S1 and S2 disclosure requirements for the financial sector? And the second question is, are you aware of a case where a central bank has both applied IFRS S1 and S2 disclosures for the financial sector, and at the same time requiring them to do additional climate or sustainability internal reporting to them?
Thank you very much for the colleagues of the Central Bank of Armenia. Really, really good questions. And again, I mean, probably in most of the prudential authorities, I think, on the call, they are aware of the recent developments by the Basel Committee, I think, on presenting the voluntary framework. They had actually consulted before on the Pillar 3 disclosures. And I should say that we've been very much in touch with the Basel Committee, with our colleagues at the BIS, in order to ensure that the recommendations were building from that basis of S1 and S2. I think there are a few examples. If you really scroll through the different profiles, you will see, for instance, the Bank of Bangladesh, which was one of the jurisdictions that came in early. It's one of the jurisdictions that they have started with the financial institutions in the jurisdiction. And they actually wanted to leverage on IFRS 1 and IFRS 2 for two reasons. One is because, of course, Bangladesh banks are pretty relevant in the overall financial system in Bangladesh, but also because the regulator wanted to have critical information, not just about climate, but as well about other sustainability risks and opportunities in order to be able to assess the safety and soundness of the financial system. I think we shouldn't lose sight that while the purpose of ISSB standards is to provide material information about sustainability risks and opportunities for investors to make informed decisions, that information can also enable other uses, particularly when it comes to risks. That information, I think, will be relevant for the prudential authorities. So being very cognizant that we wanted to reduce, to the extent possible, the overlay of prudential requirements on top of information that's suitable for markets, we had this level of engagement, I think, with the Basel Committee to ensure that if there was any addition for good reasons in order to meet prudential purposes, it was building from that global baseline. So I would encourage you to take a look, for instance, to some of the examples in some of the jurisdictions. We'll touch later on the regulatory process, but I believe that having a coherent, comprehensive, concerted approach among the different regulators in the jurisdiction, it's really critical in order to have a suitable framework that avoids having different layers of overlays that add reporting requirements. And this is why in many jurisdictions, we will talk about that, they have formed this interagency committee, adoption, readiness, working groups, basically a coalition of the different regulators that are regulating different elements within the financial system so that they have a concerted approach. So what they've done in many places, I think Rwanda is a clear example. They've started with guidelines for the financial sector, but the CMA, the professional accountancy body, which happens to be the standard setter, they have rolled out the same requirements for the real economy entities that will need to produce disclosures that actually make up the disclosures from the bank so that they can inform the prudential authorities. So all of this needs to be concerted in a way that it is additive and constructive. So we'll touch on that later on, but I think there are plenty of examples in the profiles. I've cited two, Rwanda, I think Bangladesh, but there are many others that are useful.
Yes, there is an additional question which is also very interesting, and that's about the role of the voluntary sustainability reporting in the roadmap of jurisdiction. So, what is that role? And because the attendee is saying that in the EU, the omnibus proposal may herald the wider use of voluntary reporting, possibly for all companies employing less than 1,000 employees. So, tell us a little bit about that, the voluntary sustainability reporting.
Thank you very much. Again, a very, very good question. One of the things we mentioned in the jurisdictional guide is that it was relevant for jurisdictions to be able to determine their pace of adoption in light of their market readiness. And again, of course, we are really keen to promote the adoption of our standards, but we're even more keen to ensure that our standards are applied consistently. And that requires that entities are ready to apply the requirements in the standard. So we're very much talking in our bilateral engagement with jurisdictions in order to be able to assess properly the state of maturity, because we want investors, we want beneficiaries, stakeholders, users of information to be able to have high quality disclosures that result in decision useful information. Some jurisdictions may believe that in order to mandate disclosures, they need to be able to strengthen, support their ecosystem in progressing up the ladder of becoming familiar, being able to implement the standards. A good way of doing so is basically encouraging the voluntary use of the standards until the entire ecosystem is mature in a jurisdiction. This is not just the entities that will be required to apply the standards, but it also involves the advisors that will be suggesting how advising companies, how they can get along their internal processes, their controls, their governance systems. It will also entail equipping the assurance profession if the jurisdiction determines that assurance underpins the reliability and trustworthiness of information. And I think it's also relevant to factor in the fact that the regulators, those that will need to enforce and supervise disclosures, also need to be ready. So we try to adopt a very pragmatic approach. And rather than rushing jurisdictions to adopt our standards, this is not a race. It's true that we have an urgent challenge that we need to address because investors are operating on the basis of sometimes not consistent information. And it's true that there are also climate developments that have to be addressed at the jurisdictional level. But this is not about jurisdictions coming in first. It's about jurisdictions ensuring that they measure rightly the pace for the adoption, I think, of our standards. So we will see that in many jurisdictions, it may be suitable to require the largest companies to apply the standards, but they can get the support from the other elements, perhaps the tier 2, tier 3 companies, what we call wave 2, wave 3 in the omnibus proposals, perhaps to have a slower start and focus on what is more critical. So we've seen jurisdictions like Brazil, like Nigeria, permitting the use of the standards on a voluntary basis until they mandate the application of the standards. So we think it's a suitable step for many jurisdictions to progress on the adoption of ISSB standards. And it's also true that some jurisdictions may have, let's say, a binary approach where they will not require all the entities, particularly SMEs, to apply the standards. They will do so for the largest entities, those that have a larger market cap, state of skills, capabilities to be able to do so until the ecosystem is rounded and ready in the jurisdiction.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, so let's perhaps move on to the policy rationale, because I think the discussion is lining up very nicely, again, to reflect on what are really the reasons that jurisdictions have put forward. Evie, I'll turn back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I'm going to take us through a little bit around what jurisdictions are saying and some of the rationales that we've observed in terms of why they are choosing to adopt or otherwise use the standards. So this first chart here, as you'll see, is how the IFRS Foundation thinks about the illustrative phases of a jurisdictional journey and how we can support them. So the first is becoming familiar. So jurisdictions will build awareness and understanding of the standards, and regulators and other relevant authorities and entities and investors will develop an understanding of the value proposition of the standards. Then, and this is really the core focus of the policy rationale, it's assessing the case for why and whether to adopt. So jurisdictions will assess the case. That will incorporate a lot of different entities that we'll get onto. So regulators, other relevant authorities, capital market participants, different stakeholders, policymakers themselves, investors. They will all be there to help to assess the case for adoption and consider whether the market is ready and what needs to be put in place. And that has implications for then developing the roadmap. So as the jurisdictions will develop a plan or a roadmap for adoption, the decision and the assessing the case, the policy rationale, will underpin all of those choices that it makes as it develops the roadmap and considers the reporting entities that it applies to, the scope, the regulations that are put in, and the timescale. So all of those key features of the proposed regime. And then finally, it falls to the jurisdictions to be able to introduce that legal or regulatory framework in accordance with the roadmap. So we're really focusing in this bit on number 2, assessing the case. So as I highlighted, the policy rationale really underpins many of the considerations, many of the adoption considerations. It's that guiding why jurisdictions should choose to adopt or otherwise use the standards. So in terms of why, how it impacts the regulatory process, the reporting entities, the requirements themselves, and whether the market is ready and what we can put in place to be able to do that. So there are many, many different factors that a jurisdiction can choose and can support the decision to adopt. But it really starts with the determination of why they should introduce these sustainability-related disclosure into the framework. So there may be many different rationales. That rationale can also change over time, and it also may be different for different stakeholders. But some of the critical considerations are, what are the widespread benefits of adopting the standards? So implementing the standards will enhance effective functioning of capital markets, and we'll get on to some of the other reasons. Investor preferences themselves. So increasing the trust and reliability, the comparability of decision useful information on sustainability risks and opportunities. And particularly for those investors that have long called for this information, particularly those that operate across multiple markets. They were intrinsic in the demand for the establishment of the ISSB many years ago. Jurisdictions, but also when they're defining their rationales, they should also consider their own circumstances. So where are they starting from? And how mature is sustainability reporting within the jurisdiction? What's the state of readiness? And then prepare considerations. So obviously, and if you draw upon the IFRS Foundation's cost-benefit analysis and Jonathan, I forget the name of the document, but that was released after the standards were released in June 2023. You're going to tell me the name?
The journey towards the implementation of IFRS as well and S2 and the IOSCO endorsement that I think followed that calling, I think, jurisdictions to the way in which they could adopt, apply, or otherwise use the standards. Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of issue is recognizing the upfront investment to be able to put this in place. But in a long-term perspective, it can improve the cost effectiveness and efficiency for preparers. So we have done a little bit of research at the foundation in terms of drawing upon, we highlighted the 36 jurisdictions that are on the journey and considering what are they saying and what are some of the international organizations themselves saying about why and what are the commonly cited areas of benefit for the adoption or other use of the standards. So really there are 3 kind of main buckets. The first, which is really quite critical, is strengthening capital markets by enabling informed investment decisions for capital allocation. And we've observed 4 things that really flow from this. The first is that greater transparency through the disclosure can enable better informed investment decisions through greater accuracy in assessing and pricing risks and opportunities. The next is that through that greater transparency and through that better pricing of risk, it can then support the development of local capital markets. It can facilitate access to capital and lower the cost of capital through that disclosure. It can also encourage FDI because they're aware of the status quo in terms of the sustainability risks and opportunities within that market. Another big area is it can foster investor protection because they have the information that they require to make the decisions. It can help to mitigate against greenwashing. And all these in turn, particularly in regard to the reporting on sustainability related risks, can help to then promote a more resilient financial system. And there's a lot of work that draws from resources from the IMF that talks about, and the FSB, that talks about how the ISSB standards and enhanced sustainability disclosure can support that resilience across kind of across capital markets. The second area really focuses more on sort of what the benefits are to issuers or to the entities themselves that are having to report against the ISSB standards. So improving cost effectiveness and enhancing efficiencies for issuers. So through streamlining reporting requirements, can reduce the burden and the cost associated with sustainability related disclosure and improve that cost effectiveness. Part of the challenge prior to the establishment of the ISSB was that you had a real plethora of different reporting requirements, but the ISSB standards incorporate the recommendations of the TCFD and build upon and have taken over the SASB standards and the integrated reporting framework and the CDSB guidance. And so it's drawing together all of this wealth of knowledge that then, if we can align to a singular set of standards that are the ISSB standards as a baseline, it enables issuers to be thinking about across their jurisdictions, across their different reporting areas, they have a singular set of standards to be able to report against. And so that will reduce the burden and cost. And that leads quite nicely onto the global baseline, facilitating alignment of reporting across jurisdictions. So by having a baseline that then jurisdictions may choose to build upon, but by having a baseline that is aligned across jurisdictions, entities that report and operate in many jurisdictions can have a very efficient sustainability reporting requirements. The third area is enabling jurisdictions to leverage the global baseline of sustainability related disclosures for other use cases. Now, this one's a little bit more all-encapsulating because we recognize that there are key capital market considerations, there are key benefits to issuers, but there are also broader ranging benefits to the wider ecosystem in terms of the ISSB standards. And to be able to leverage that global baseline for other reasons. So the first is it can support the deepening of financial market architecture, including sustainable finance architecture. So the data that is provided can be used for those other sustainable finance ventures, so the establishment of bond markets, that sort of thing. The next is the building blocks approach. So you may have heard this be spoken about in previous presentations by my colleagues. It's really quite critical to our baseline approach is that, we are providing information to serve capital markets through the reporting under the ISSB standards. But we recognize that jurisdictions may want to meet their own reporting requirements and their own objectives. And we say, jurisdictions, as long as they adhere and align to the global baseline, there's no reason why they can't go further themselves if they wish to meet their own disclosure objectives while still realizing the benefits of the global baseline. And so, and it relates to the fourth point, the baseline and the ISSB standards can then support other domestic and international policy objectives, as the jurisdiction may choose to use this information or to go further. And you'll have seen recently, and Jonathan will touch upon it, for instance, the decisions with the equivalents in regard to GRI as something that speaks to this point. The final piece is improved access to foreign capital markets and global trade competitiveness throughout the supply chain. So through having this aligned regulatory global baseline across regulatory regimes in different jurisdictions, it can support trade competitiveness. It can reporting and if you're reporting to ISSB standards, it can support those markets that want to access global supply chains that may require ISSB standards reporting. So it can boost a jurisdiction's competitiveness if they're reporting against ISSB and taking part in that baseline. So I'll just pause here And I will also just give a quick update on where we are on this piece of work. So, because we're planning something sort of into the latter half of the year that will build upon this. So, we have, as a group, we've subsequently collated a lot of this research and a lot of the evidence that has come from jurisdictions that are already on their way towards adoption or the other use of our standards, and held a separate round table with some key policymakers, World Bank colleagues, the IMF, some of the bilateral partners, some of the UN organizations, sort of many different stakeholders around this policy rationale for adoption. And we are working on a paper to be released, anticipated Q3, end of Q3 this year, that will be published by the foundation, and will be able to support those jurisdictions by highlighting and going into more depth on these three pillar areas. Now, we anticipate that this will hopefully support jurisdictions by having somewhat of a reference point that draws together those sort of examples that other jurisdictions have provided, and those rationales, and it gives an idea of how other jurisdictions are thinking about the decision and why to adopt. So very much a guidance piece, one of the content pieces that we discussed as part of the broader regulatory program. So accompanying this will be a module that will take you through some of those key decision areas, much like we are discussing today with the roadmap tool. So this is something that is very much in the work, and we look forward to disseminating and discussing with yourselves and different forums when it is released towards the latter part of the year. And I'll pause there if there's any questions, and Jonathan, if you want to come in at all on that at all.
Yeah, let's go to Jonathan. We don't have any questions right now. And also, we might need to expedite the presentation a little bit because if we have any more questions, we'll need more time for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. Just very quickly, I think, again, through the work that I think PB outlined that's coming up, we're trying to enable you as regulators, as central banks, as authorities, to be able both to engage with your stakeholders, but as well with your policymakers that will need to have an understanding. So stay tuned for this work. We will certainly ensure that that piece comes to your attention. Again, following Arun's advice, let's move on because, again, you know, this is all great, but how can we get started? So this is actually the intent of the roadmap development tool, I think, in the process. So we can move to the next slide, please. Again, I think EB outlined earlier today how, you know, the jurisdictional phases actually work out. I'm not sure if the slides are being updated. I think we're still there. So I think it was just written me that our Zoom is crashed. So let me see if I can present myself the slides. So okay, now, so let me see. Now it is, so I should be able, I think, to get to the slides. So here I am. Are you able to see the slides? Not yet? Oh, yes.
Yes, we can. We can.
Here they are. Our apologies, I think, for that little glitch. Hopefully it's resolved right now. So again, the purpose, I think, of the roadmap development tool is to try to support those jurisdictions that are actually developing, I think, the roadmap. So again, I think a roadmap is not strictly necessary in order to progress with the adoption or other use of ISSB standards. We think it's useful in setting a clear objective, critical milestones, bringing together different stakeholders, ensuring that the different regulators, we were talking before about that, coalesce around a jurisdictional ambition. It helps assign responsibilities, helps measure progress, and again, really important, identify the interdependencies in the ecosystem and between different regulatory pieces. We were talking before about that interplay between prudential and general purpose financial reporting and the different overlays and how that can be constructed in a way that is reasonable. So again, I think the roadmap development tool, it will be particularly helpful, I think, in assessing the implications of the decisions made, the approaches, how the approach that a jurisdiction may be pursuing is understood by its market participants, and also very importantly, how eventually a jurisdictional profile will describe the jurisdiction along the 7 descriptions that we touched on, I think, before. So I think it's important to note, and the tool is available on our website. Each of you can access the tool if you really want to mingle around with what are the details. There's an Excel file, so you can actually play around with that. And you will be finding that, again, there are 4 decision areas, and there is overarching guidance for each of the 4 R's that we call: regulatory process, reporting entities, requirements, readiness. There are also key matters for considerations, a checklist of decisions to be made, and a potential spectrum of outcomes resulting from the considerations and the decisions. And those outcomes will be mapped against the roadmap templates that we have made available. The roadmap templates are very much along the lines of, for each of the features, trying to come up with how that impacts the description of the jurisdictional approach. So I was touching before the 4 R's, the 4 decision areas. And again, I think all of the features in the jurisdictional guide have been grouped in order to facilitate decision-making by the different regulators. So I'm coming back. These are the illustrative templates. So we have developed one for each of those descriptions, and they're available on our website. So you can actually contrast the decisions you made against those descriptions. So I think it's an easy way for jurisdictions, for regulators to be able to test the results of some of the decisions. So this would be, for instance, an illustration of the templates. So you will see in green, for instance, the results for full adoption, contrasting with those features that do not result in full adoption. And again, it's important to mention this applies for what we call the current approach. What's the status of the framework as of today versus the target? How I do expect that my regulatory framework will evolve until it's finally settled. So I think this is a useful exercise where you can contrast those decisions depending on how they look like. And again, as the sustainability disclosure standard setter, we believe that we're not responsible for the entire ecosystem, but we're inviting jurisdictions to reflect on some of those elements that we think significantly underpin the quality of disclosures. So we do have our audit-related peers setting standards, but again, we're asking jurisdictions from the get-go to consider what's the role that assurance can play in enhancing the trustworthiness of information. Eventually, it's necessary for investors to have trust and confidence in the disclosures, so that really strengthens capital markets. And that is an important consideration from the get-go that jurisdictions should have in mind as they put together the roadmap. I think also we shouldn't lose sight that in order to have high quality disclosures, there's a need for the supervisors and the enforcers to play a role. Again, here, we believe that at this very nascent stage where disclosures are relatively new for many entities, we think there's a need for regulators to consider what's a smart regulatory approach, which perhaps is not, approaching regulation from pure sanctioning regime, but actually guiding, supporting, hand-holding the markets to be able to ensure they're successful in the way they produce disclosures, maybe through surveillance, maybe through having focus areas where they have identified perhaps some shortcomings and take actions to provide capacity building. Again, digital reporting, particularly important. Information is increasingly being consumed digitally, and it is particularly important in terms of interoperability if the same data can actually be applied to be able to meet requirements in different frameworks. So these are all considerations that we're inviting regulators, I think, to consider. So here's a link where you can access the roadmap development tool. I think, again, scanning the QR code should you should be able to access that, I think, on your mobile phones as well. So the tool is out there. There's a PDF, there are Excels, the templates are available. So we just encourage you to play around with that. So maybe just drilling into the very specific content. The first decision area, it's the regulatory process. And I think as you have already been identified through the questions that have been coming, I think it's important to be able to identify which are the dynamics here that come into play. And one of the things we mentioned in our jurisdictional guide is that, of course, it's relevant to identify what's really the regulatory or legal standing of the jurisdiction, and whether the requirements will be introduced on a mandatory basis, or whether there will be an express reference for entities to use the standards on a voluntary basis. And here, again, it's important for the regulators to be able to identify, assess which are the existing laws and regulation in the jurisdiction. Really important, determine and identify what are the implications of any extraterritorial requirements, both inbound and outbound. What are the extraterritorial requirements that you coming up with a regulatory framework may have on your neighboring jurisdictions? And similarly, if I decide to include extensions of reliefs, is that really a true relief if many of my companies will still need to report scope 3 tomorrow because another jurisdiction will be requiring them to do so? So some transitional reliefs may not be effective because another regulator has imposed that as a requirement. So I think it is important to bring all of that together. Again, the interaction between the different authorities, insurance, capital markets, for the financial institutions, central banks, for other entities, maybe the policymaker has the responsibility to determine corporate law. So I think it is important to determine, I think, the alignment, the potential overlaps, and the potential conflicts between laws and regulations. And I think it's worth noting that for jurisdictions to be described as fully adopting ISSB standards, they need to pass on laws and regulations that prescribe on a mandatory basis the application of ISSB standards. There are other mechanisms, and again, as we discussed before, permitting the use of standards, it is perhaps a suitable step in the journey towards the adoption of ISSB standards. So again, one thing that's also important is to consider what are the mechanisms for adoption of ISSB standards. And we need to be mindful that we're at the beginning of the journey. We have only issued S1 and S2. I think we have outlined, and you probably are aware, the work that we are undertaking and with respect to biodiversity, nature, human capital. We're also enhancing SASB standards. And we're at the early stages of the standard setting cycle. So as it is customary in standard setting, there may be a post-implementation review. So I think it's relevant for jurisdictions to understand this is not a one-time off. Jurisdictions will need to develop the mechanisms, the vehicles, the platforms to ensure that the requirements stay up to date, particularly at this stage where I think we're all still learning what sustainability reporting is intended to deliver. So those jurisdictions that believe, oh, I'll set my own standard setter, I'll devote a lot of resources to come up with my own standards. A lot of resources will need to be devoted still later on. And I think jurisdictions need to be cognizant. What is really the value of the global baseline? It is also a cost-effective way to leverage standards that have got that sort of international clearance, IOSCO's endorsement, high-quality due process. The governance model of the IFRS Foundation and jurisdictions can actually focus on what matters most, building capacity for their preparers, for the assessors, for the assurance providers to be able to do high quality work. So again, these are important considerations. I think many jurisdictions will need to determine which is the body that has the statutory powers. In many jurisdictions, it may be the central bank. In other jurisdictions, it may be a standard setter that has been designated. But in many jurisdictions, however, whoever is the leading adoption authority, it is relevant that they have a concerted approach and consensus is being driven. I think it will not be a good situation for any jurisdiction if there are fragmented, diverse requirements coming up that eventually result in duplicative requirements for entities. And again, there are different models and legal instruments to come up with regulations. We've seen in many of the jurisdictions that were profiled that listed entities, certainly because of their size, because of their international exposure, because of their public accountability, are probably the first ones to be onboarded as part of the regulation. So many jurisdictions have opted for coming up with listing rules. So the stock exchanges have come with guidance or obligations for listed entities. Sometimes it's the standard setter coming with standards that still require the application by different regulated entities. Sometimes it's the central bank, the Securities Commission, the insurance oversight body. In many cases, as we mentioned before, the Bangladesh Bank, it's the central bank coming right away with legislation, both for general purpose financial reporting, but as well for regulations. And we've seen a number of instances where it is directly the policymakers, it's really the government. For instance, the UK, they're just consulting on the UK sustainability reporting standards. In Turkey as well, it is the audit oversight body which operates under the auspices, I think, of the Ministry of Finance. So I think it's important for jurisdictions to identify which is the legal vehicle, the tool that's more suitable for the introduction of their standards into their regulation. And as well, what is the level of prescriptiveness? In the securities regulatory space, guidance, it's probably a non-authoritative set of recommendations, whereas in the prudential domain, guidelines do have a mandatory legally binding effect on those companies that are subject to their application. So I think it's important as well to assess the level of prescriptiveness, of the authoritativeness of those regulations. I think I've been covering the permission of the standards as well, but one important element as well is to be able to assess what is the starting point for us, what is the regime that prevails in the jurisdiction that can be a stepping stone towards the introduction of ISSB standards. And again, we were noting a few examples here. For instance, in the UK, they have a mandatory application of TCFD. And as you know, TCFD is very much embedded into IFRS 1 and IFRS 2. So it may be easier for some jurisdictions that have already an embedded TCFD regime to move ahead and just incorporate the elements that are in S1 and S2. In Chile, for instance, it probably was a bit easier. They will actually be moving fast because they will be fully adopting by 2026. They had TCFD in addition to a requirement to apply SASB standards. So a pretty comprehensive set of the requirements in ISSB standards were already there. Some jurisdictions already had listing rules for sustainability-related reporting. So what they've done in an intro stage is basically refresh them and bring them up to speed, incorporating elements of S1 and S2. In the case of Hong Kong, even more, they've updated their listing rules, but they have also signaled they want full alignment with ISSB standards, and they have actually enabled their standard setter to produce fully aligned standards that will be adopted in 2028. So all these ecosystem considerations, I think, are important. So we were talking before about the different adoption models that are available. We're talking before about the adoption readiness model. So again, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Nigeria, there's a professional accountancy body led. This is very much predominant, I think, in Africa. The PAOs happen to be the standard setters. And again, so just different models that I think are useful for you to take as a consideration. And depending on what is the nature of your mandate as a regulator, some of these examples can be useful reference points for you perhaps to draw from the good learnings from those jurisdictions. And again, a couple of important elements I think for you is to note that in order to translate ISSB standards, and I believe I'm being translated today by a number of colleagues, it's important that you can understand well. So it is relevant to determine whether there is any translation that may be needed in order to fully equip your markets, your stakeholders to be able to engage with the standards. I think it's also important to understand that jurisdictions using ISSB standards, they will need to get into a license with the IFRS Foundation so that they can actually make use of the standards. Adoption by reference, which is basically introducing a requirement in law that makes reference directly to IFRS 1 and IFRS 2, doesn't require a license, but other models where you're actually taking from the standards to construct your own regime requires, I think, that approach. So again, inviting you all that have an interest in reaching out to your respective assessors or to the IFRS Foundation Translations, Adoption and Copyright team so that they can advise you on what's the most suitable approach. So again, I do not intend to cover that, but I think it's important that we move into the who, which are the entities that should actually be onboarded. This is a very critical stage in setting an adoption roadmap. So I'll turn back to Evie. Thank you.
Thank you, and apologies for my technical difficulties a little bit earlier. So I'm going to cover the reporting entities, so who it requires to. So in terms of the features of the jurisdictional approaches, the extent to which the requirements are applicable to all or most domestic publicly accountable entities. Then when applicable, which of those requirements are required to which parts of the market? So the first, or the prime, premium, senior, and the second standard tiers of publicly accountable entities. And then the reporting entity itself. So are the requirements for the same reporting entity as for the related financial statement, or the requirements for consolidated sustainability related financial information? Go to the next slide. So when we're thinking about, which publicly accountable entities, the matters for consideration that we have are determining whether domestically publicly accountable entities are subject to the requirements, whether they're going to be introduced in a single step, or whether it's going to be scaled and phased over time. And we've seen many different approaches from jurisdictions that have already chosen to adopt. And then, are there any other entities that are going to be subject to any of these requirements? So it leads to a series of decision points, thinking about the categories of the entities who are subject to the requirements, what that subset is, a particular sector, so banks and financial institutions only, for example, or listed entities. Are they phased or scaled in? What is the effective date for those entities? So thinking also, this links quite heavily towards readiness of those segments that will be included. Will it be required for entities without public accountability and foreign publicly accountable entities? Now, the outcome that we're saying is most functionally aligned is all or most publicly accountable entities have to be in scope. Go to the next slide. We then think about market segments. So whether all or only specific classes or tiers of listed entities will be subject to the requirements. So will the requirements be differentiated? Will listed entities in that first and second tier be subject to them? And at what point will the requirements be extended? So if you have it in the first tier from the most prominent effective date, in the future, will it go beyond large and listed entities? And so again, we're saying that outcome that leads and tends towards full adoption is all or most.
Evie, maybe I can comment just very quickly, because I saw a question, I think, from Paul Thompson about, putting the emphasis perhaps on the voluntary approach for the smaller entities. And I think it's relevant perhaps to reflect on one of the features in the jurisdictional guide. And I think we were cognizant very much that at these very early stages, of course, our standards have been designed for information that's decision useful for capital markets. And one of the things we were very explicit about is that we should be considering the top tiers, I think, in the market. So I think the prime and perhaps the standard tiers, and that there would be other suitable options perhaps for SMEs, even for listed entities that are, let's say, in the venture, growth, or entry markets, that perhaps may be a bit too demanding ISSB standards for them initially until the market is more ready. So I think, just trying to address that question, that of course, voluntary reporting for those entities that perhaps are not at the top end of the capital market may be a very suitable approach. And there are references already in the jurisdictional guide alluding to that. And again, maybe TCFD, which is again embedded in ISSB standards, is a good way forward in order to embed all of that. Sorry, Evie, back to you.
No, I think it's a very, very relevant question. It's something we get asked all the time, is about the applicability of SMEs. So I think Jonathan's answer there is absolutely on point. If we go to the next slide. So, this gives some examples, for instance, on what different jurisdictions have thought about in terms of the inclusion of publicly accountable entities within the scope. And you can see a little bit of a differentiated approach. So Turkey in Australia, they've included most PAEs. So Turkey, it's those that exclude the threshold values of at least two of the criteria. So 500 million Turkish liras assets or annual net sales revenue of 1 billion liras and workforce size. And they're expected to expand that in the future. So, going beyond thinking about the different segmentation. In Australia, they've made the requirement for group 1 to 3 of reporting entities that includes most PAs. But in contrast, Mexico and Bangladesh have been a little bit more selective. So in Mexico, the proposal to adopt IFRS 1 and IFRS S2 is for listed entities, but not for financial institutions. And conversely, in Bangladesh, it's for banks and financial institutions only. So again, it really, really depends, and it comes down to sort of that underpinning rationale that, as we discussed, and links to some of those points around the sort of market readiness as well. But going back to the point that I raised, for it to be considered working towards full adoption, it needs to be most PAEs. And that's what we would advocate for. If you go to the next slide. Then the sort of final area there is the reporting entity itself. So considering whether sustainability related financial disclosures will be required for the same reporting entity as for the related financial statements, and whether those requirements will be consolidated or there's separate subsidiary financial statements. And so again, the sort of outcome that leads towards full adoption, it's the same reporting entity for the financial statements, as opposed to either those that are not specified or those that are not the same reporting entity. And next slide. And I will hand back over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Evie. And again, so progressing to the third pillar, the third R, requirements, this is a pretty critical one, because of course that will determine what's the scope of information that stakeholders will receive. And again, it's a pretty central consideration in the roadmap for jurisdictions to determine whether ISSB standards will be fully incorporated into the framework, and if not, what's the degree perhaps of alignment of the local requirements. And we'll touch later on that concept, whether jurisdictions will develop local requirements or standards that result in functionally aligned outcomes. I'm really interested in covering what that means, because again, we've been putting the focus very much on the outcomes, not the form. Again, we're not asking jurisdictions to verbatim copy every single word in the standard. It is, again, focusing very much on the outcomes. But I think it's important that we're cognizant that departing from the outcomes that we believe are instrumental in ensuring investors receive decision useful information, I think will be detrimental, I think, to achieving that degree, I think, of alignment. So it's important to determine the degree of alignment, whether any modifications are temporary, whether they're long-term, and again, what's really the approach, whether it's direct reference or it's the development of local standards. So again, I want to spend some time here because I think this is an important one, because again, we're very much looking for primary users to receive the same type of information so that they can actually make informed decisions about providing resources to the entity. We were talking about our standards being central to the capital markets and as well enabling other users, but this is really central. Investors being able to make, I think, those informed decisions. So again, the determination is made on a case-by-case basis. It's on the basis of the review on all the different features. But I just wanted perhaps to touch on some of the parameters that we feel are really relevant in order to be incorporated into the frameworks. For those of you that may be considering eventually developing, I think, your own standards. The concept of materiality, it is important. And here, as we've been working together with our European counterparts, aligning the definition of information that is material to meet the needs of primary users, that is very much at the core. And that needs to be distinct if a double materiality approach is pursued, and that needs to be aligned with the definition of material information in IFRS S1, which takes us to the other point, which is what if those jurisdictions want to have a broader approach and have additional disclosures, very much the building blocks approach that Evie was talking to when she was covering the policy rationale. And again, I think it's important, and it will be a key consideration in our assessment of the degree of alignment, whether additional information being required beyond that is intended to meet the needs of primary users, that is investors. Whether the information for investors is clearly identifiable, and again, it needs to be stated that any additional incremental an overlay of information doesn't obscure information required by ISSB standards that is decision useful. So again, there is a useful constructive way of having an approach that goes beyond, meets other jurisdictional or other policy goals or the needs of other information needs of other stakeholders, but that is very central to the delivery of aligned information. Again, elements around timing, location, and reporting entity are pretty critical because we want investors to be able to cross between financial information on the financial statements and the sustainability-related risks and opportunities in order to be able to make decisions. So we will be, again, very much looking into whether the timing of reporting is aligned at the same time, whether the location is for general purpose financial reports, and whether the reporting entity is the same. Again, for the same reasons, we believe this is information that's relevant for general purpose financial reporting. Core elements of the TCFD structure need to be embedded, connected information, and again, I want to highlight the importance of having requirements that address current and anticipated effects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities on the business model and the value chain. This is very central. This is very much, again, what we're trying to address at the ISSBs, and it is a very central consideration that jurisdictions should be looking into. And again, I'll just have another comment on industry-specific information. That is, again, a central requirement in our standards. We are now consulting on SASB standards. And again, I think it's important to reflect on what are the requirements in ISSB standards, which is, again, to refer to and consider, which doesn't mean that all the industry-specific, all the industry-based guidance needs to be applied. It needs to be referred to and considered. And entities will have, I think, the ability, the judgment to determine what are the metrics that are really useful for them. In terms of S2, and again, I've mentioned materiality before, so I will not be covering that, but I think it's important in order to be functionally aligned to ensure that there are requirements in terms of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And again, from a jurisdictional perspective, we're not looking to the entire spectrum of entities in a jurisdiction. We're looking into those entities that have public accountability and very much the top end of the market, the financial institutions. I think that's a reasonable starting point, which is why we noted that in the inaugural guide at this stage of the journey. Another important element is that the GHG protocol needs to be required as the measurement framework for the GHG emissions, as well as financed emissions. I think for those entities that have, which activities include asset management, commercial banking, and insurance. And you all know that we don't prescribe entities having targets or transition plans, but if they do so, even either because they have to comply with a requirement to do so, or because they have set targets or transition plan themselves, we do require them to include disclosures about that. So that's a very central element that we will be looking into. And a final element around resilience and scenario analysis. So this is very much the considerations that we believe a jurisdictional framework needs to meet in order to be able to be determined that it's designed to provide functionally aligned outcomes. So a very central consideration. And again, just to be very clear, additional disclosure requirements are truly possible. IFRS 1 already talks about that. But again, they need to be incorporated in a way that they do not obscure information that's required by ISSB standards to meet the needs of investors. So that's a very central consideration for, I think, obvious reasons. And again, you will have probably heard from many investors that they want information that is material. They don't want every single piece of information. Volume, presentation of information does impact whether information can be identifiable. And I think it's obscured. I've covered before placement, location, and timing, so I will not be covering that one in particular. So just perhaps a final word before we open up, I think, for comments in terms of readiness, which is the final pillar. So Ibi, let's cover that one quickly so that we can then just perhaps have a couple of words on interoperability.
Absolutely no problem. So yeah, the final area, which is really quite critical, is readiness. So consideration of the effective date and any transition reliefs that a jurisdiction may choose to bring into its roadmap decisions. So if we go to the next slide. There are two features that are really quite critical. So effective date, so when the requirements in the standards become currently effective, noting that S1 and S2 include transition standard reliefs already built in to the standards themselves, and then the extent and nature of jurisdictional modifications on any transition reliefs themselves. So changes to or exemption from requirements in ISSB standards other than the transition adoption reliefs. So we go to the next slide. So the guidance that we provide here, and I'll just cover these very briefly. The first is time frame, so consideration of the assessment of market readiness that can guide when those effective date decisions or when those transition reliefs come in. Maturity and familiarity and sustainability related reporting. So some of those standards that I mentioned right at the beginning that the ISSB standards have built upon and incorporated, and familiarity, any entities that are already applying sustainability related disclosures can be able to support that assessment of market readiness. The scaling and phasing, so jurisdictions could consider whether to scale or phase requirements, such as the size and preparedness of entities, or the industries and segments, so relating back to the scope that we discussed earlier. Capacity, so recognizing that all markets, whether they're emerging or not, this is something that's new, so there are going to be capacity building needs within the market, and what actually will be required to be able to support the implementation, and there's consideration of that in respect to the timelines and the effective date and those reliefs that are put in place and what the market can do to be able to support that implementation. But then also conversely considering any shortcomings of strategies that don't result in the delivery of disclosure against the ISSB standards or delay the comparability of that information. So we go to the next slide. There's then the consideration of balancing what the entities need and their state of readiness with what the investors themselves want in terms of their demanding this enhanced transparency and comparability. Consideration of proportionality. So there's proportionality mechanisms that have already been built into the standards by our board of reasonably and supportable information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost or effort, and consideration to the skills, capabilities, and resources available to the entity when disclosing against particular aspects. Then I mentioned the transition standard reliefs. So there are reliefs that are already built into the standards to facilitate the initial application, available to all entities in the first year they apply. And then transition adoption reliefs. So we recommend if further extensions are required, the phasing is limited to the following areas: climate first reporting, so that's IFRS S2, the timing of the reporting, the greenhouse gas protocol, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. We go to the next slide.
One quick clarification, Evie, if I may. When we mean climate first reporting, is IFRS S2 with the relevant portions of S1. So climate reporting in accordance with ISSB standards is not possible without embedding the relevant portions of S1.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple of examples here. I'll let you just gaze over them. Turkey, Brazil, and Uganda, all different examples of effective date that they've provided for different relevant thresholds. And if we go to the next slide. So for those transition reliefs, the consideration really is, are you considering beyond, or are you limiting it only to the transition standard reliefs? Are you extending those reliefs? Are you deferring or delaying requirements in S1 or S2 beyond what we're subject to? And any type or extent of reliefs that are required. So our outcomes, like towards full adoption, is the transition standard reliefs only. And then we have two different approaches that link to the long extension of transition standard reliefs and the limited extension of transition standard reliefs. And if you read the roadmap tool, it gives you the explicit timelines that those two apply for. And then the prior being any additional reliefs and extensions that go beyond those two other outcomes. We go to the next. And this gives you, again, a couple of examples. So Brazil, for instance, the transition standard reliefs are the ones that have been incorporated. But then if you look at Canada, in contrast, they've given an additional relief on sustainability matters beyond climate for an additional year, 2 years on Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, 2 years on the quantitative aspects of scenario analysis. So really, really commensurate to the considerations that have to be considered in regard to the market readiness of that jurisdiction. Next slide. Yeah.
Thank you, Evie. And
no problem.
Perhaps just bringing this all together, and again, just inviting, I think, participants to make use of the tool that's available. So again, I think there's a PDF, there's an Excel. You can actually play around with all those questions that we've tried to provide a bit of a teaser, and you also have the template. So I think that provides, I think, a good opportunity. And we'll open up, I think, for questions right now, but I just wanted to cover, I think, an important element that we haven't touched really until now, which is actually the benefits of interoperability. And again, we're very cognizant when we set our standards that, of course, other jurisdictions were already also spearheading ahead. We had developments, of course, in Europe. I think the US back in the day were also coming up, I think, with requirements. So a lot of the work has been in identifying those common disclosures so that we reduce duplication. We need to be mindful that reporting has a cost for entities, and we need to do this in a streamlined, smart way so that information that's being produced is useful, but it is not a burden for companies, which is perhaps what we're seeing in some jurisdictions, why some preparers are actually pushing back. I think we also need to be mindful of the cross-border considerations. Jurisdictions, of course, have the right, and they should be looking into their own jurisdictional considerations. But I think it's important that we look into what are the global aspects as well. Reducing complexity, reducing fragmentation. I think it's very much, at the core of all of that. So what we've done, I think, again, in the ESRS's ISSB interoperability guidance was, again, try to enable a way in which companies that prepare their disclosures on the basis of ISSB standards can also use those in order to be able to comply with ESRS's. And of course, I think there are different chapters in the interoperability guide so that those preparers that have started on their ISSB journey, they can identify what is additional and incremental in ESRS's in a way that they can comply. And conversely, those preparers that have started with ESRS's, they do understand which are the options that they need to pick within ESRS's in order to be able to comply as well with ISSB standards. So it is not an automatic compliance. So disclosures need to be prepared in a particular way in order to be able to meet both set of requirements at the same time. And as I was touching on before, that whole option of not obscuring, I think it's very central, I think, to those considerations. And of course, you're aware that there are a number of developments, I think, in the European space, probably with daily announcements from our counterparts. I think yesterday, probably today, EFRAG SRB was having their own discussions. I just wanted perhaps to summarize where we're coming from and where we're heading, because of course, this is an ongoing chapter, and we intend very much to have a dialogue, I think, with our counterparts to ensure that the degree of interoperability, the degree of alignment is preserved as it was a central instruction in the Omnibus Directive in order to, again, equip the ecosystems to be effective. So again, you will have seen that there was an update on the first simplification, stage 1 of ESRS's. We're expecting, I think, an exposure draft coming out very soon, probably earlier than we were originally expected. And I think, we welcome, at least from ISSB, the fact that I think we may have a bit more time for the revised ESRS's. It's true, it's a very compounded timeline. But again, this is a moving space, so stay tuned. Again, our goal is, again, continue to work on the journey that we have already embarked, which is, again, to strengthen interoperability in a way that our core goals, I think, can be met. Just a very quick word, again, with respect to interoperability with GRI, because, again, you will have seen some announcements recently with respect to GRI, I think, granting equivalence on the use of IFRS S2. And again, we continue to work with them, execute, I think, the goals that we had set in the MOU. And I think our goal is very much to streamline reporting. I think from the different standard setters, we very much acknowledge that we need to work together in order to ensure that ultimately stakeholders, users receive the information that's useful in a way that we're still allowing companies to do this in an effective way. And particularly nowadays where that term competitiveness, simplification is daily buzzing, I think, on our news. I think it's important that this is very central to the consideration, and having a global concerted approach, pursuing, I think, the global baseline, I think is very central, which is what we wanted to bring for your consideration. Many of you are probably subject to different dynamics, very close, I think, to the European gravitational effect, but also very cognizant that you have many entities that will need to report as well in accordance with frameworks that have been aligned with ISSB standards. So we wanted to ensure you had that level of information and you were cognizant and aware of the tools that we have been developing to support your steps going forward. And perhaps the final word before we open up for questions. Thank you very much again, Arun, Svetlana, for allowing us, I think, this level of in-depth, I think, the dialogue, I think, with your members. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Evie. Very well done. Excellent. So maybe I just ask the last question before handing over to Svetlana, because we are expected to close soon. So from your perspective, as the jurisdictions begin to implement the ISSB standards, what are the most critical success factors that will determine whether the adoption has led to meaningful sustainability reporting outcomes? I'm asking this particular question because when Svetlana and we work together on this particular program, AirShore, under which we are conducting this conference, we are focusing more and more on results now. So we start from results and then we try to see how to reach at the results or how to achieve them. So tell us how to focus on outcomes and what are the critical success factors?
Thank you very much, Arun and Svetlana, I think, for the question. Really, really, really important one. And again, I think we should be mindful, what is the end goal, which is to ensure that sustainability-related information, particularly on sustainability risk and opportunities, is of high quality, is comparable, and enable decision useful by investors, but as well by other stakeholders. That has to be very central. So what we think it's a critical factor for success is, of course, ensure that jurisdictions can actually graduate the adoption pace to their respective market readiness. I think that readiness assessment is pretty fundamental. And we believe it's also pretty relevant to have jurisdictions, particularly the regulators, the relevant authorities, coalesce around that common goal, setting a concerted jurisdictional ambition, driving consensus among the different regulators, ensuring you keep stakeholders abreast of every single milestone, enabling a consultative process so that you allow buy-in and you explain properly what's the policy rationale. That can ensure success. And we shouldn't lose sight that there is a capacity building effort. And let's be practical here. The IFRS Foundation is developing educational resources. I think we published last week a couple of pieces out there on transition plan disclosure guidance, on how industry-based information can support. There's been disclosures as well on GHG emissions. I think it's critical that jurisdictions approach capacity building in a smart way, leverage existing resources, focus your efforts and resources on enabling those preparers to have that dialogue. Let's don't reinvent the wheel. Let's not create 10 different pieces of guidance addressing the same point. This is what we've tried to do at the IFRS Foundation with the establishment of the ISSB. Use the best from all those frameworks that have been applied, leverage on the experience that it's out there, build and construct as a stepping stone towards. I think that is pretty relevant, I think, in the success journey. And of course, listen to your investors, listen to your stakeholders, the users. I think they're very central as to whether information is deemed to be material or not. And focus on what is material information. We are not doing a service to stakeholders having 500 pages reports of a lot of information that may not be that critical. I think it's relevant that we are able to identify what's really core for decision making. That my views, Arun. Hope that's useful. Even not sure whether you want to add anything to that.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you so much, Evie, and thank you so much, Jonathan. We are grateful to you for being here today. I hand over the floor back to Svetlana. Svetlana, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arun. Thank you very much, Evie and Jonathan, for your great contribution today. So I invite all participants for a big round of virtual applauses to you for your great contribution. There is one more question from Vesna regarding cooperation, but we'll follow up separately with Vesna by email on this question. So again, thank you very much, dear participants, for your active participation today, for your questions. I hope we answered all your questions today. And let me inform you that the final webinar in this series will take place next Wednesday and is organized in cooperation with Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And we'll try to address aspects related to calculated financed emissions across various asset types, highlighting again practical calculation and method. And we are pretty sure you will enjoy the next webinar as well. Again, dear friends, this webinar was organized under the Enhancing Accounting, Auditing and Sustainability Reporting regional program, co-funded by the Austrian Federal Ministry of Finance, Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, and the Austrian Development Agency. Many thanks again to our donors for their great support with sustainability reporting reform in our region. Thanks again to the entire CFRR team for their support, of course, to our interpreters for helping us understand each other today. And hope to see you all next Wednesday.